format of the event and then obviously introduce the panelists. So we want the event to be very interactive. We're all here to talk about the unknown unknowns in engineering leadership. I'm not an engineer. I actually run sales and marketing for Plato, but I also have been a first-time manager in the past and also a first-time executive. So I have a lot of similar challenges that you guys all face. But we know that everybody here has really interesting stories to share and insights. And so while we have a really great panel to kick off the conversation, we're going to do the panel portion for about 40 minutes. We're using Slido. You can submit questions there, and we'll sort of integrate that into the panel discussion for that portion. After the panel, we're going to do roundtable discussions. So we're going to be discussing here the unknown unknowns that these 5 people have faced in their careers. And then we want you guys to also share your own insights with your group. We're going to do that for about 20, 25 minutes. And at the end, we're going to ask that one person from each table stand up and kind of let us know who you are and what are some of the insights that you all discussed and shared. So it can be a really good exchange of information. So I guess to kick off the panel, these are our esteemed panelists. So we have Mary McNish. Did I say that right? Sorry. Okay. The former VP of Worldwide Engineering at Excellion. Tomas is the head of engineering at Checker, VP of engineering. Anantha is running the engineering team that's doing self-driving technology, which is really cool. And then we have Colleen, who is the head of security at Segment. And Kwang here is the CEO of Plato and will be moderating the panel. So I'll be back after that portion to remind everybody what's happening next. So enjoy. Thank you.
I don't think. Okay. All right. Okay.
This one works, and maybe it's just the.
Okay. Cool. So thank you very much for being here. So last week we've been talking, the 5 of us, and we've been talking a lot about what has been your unknown as a manager, etc. And after 10 minutes, so Colin searched on Google about, wait a minute, what is unknown? Good question. So I searched in Google and I found this. So as leaders, we have what we call known, so things we know, known unknown, so things we know we don't know, and unknown, so things we don't know. So we face a lot of uncertain situations as leaders. What will be the sales next week, next month, this quarter? If our product is going to be successful? Is the technology is going to be robust? Is the security is going to be right? So those are things that we can anticipate, but the most complex and challenging things are things we don't know. So things that are really unexpected. So when we are experienced leaders, we try to have some frameworks about how we can address them, how we can identify them, and how we can learn from other persons who have been through them before. So this is the definition I came through. And so first question for you, Ananta. So you mentioned last time we spoke that unknowns were a big topic at Dropbox when you were a senior director of engineering at Dropbox. So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so it was, like Dropbox is a big service, right? Like, so there's a lot of things happening, 600 million people, lots of files. So there was this period where we kept having these series of outages, like every day there would be a new SEV. I don't know if everybody follows the concept of SEV. it's a site event. So usually like it's an incident. Then, for example, one of them was like, somebody updated somehow the switches which are on top of our racks. And that changed. That caused like a major outage. I mean, everything else, like you kind of, some intern checks in a code and then there's no test catching it. And sure, okay, that's a known unknown and you kind of catch that. But things like this, the switch going out and like suddenly the entire thing coming down, we really never anticipated this. So then the guy who used to run the infrastructure team at Dropbox, so he just started like coming up with his mantra. Like, I mean, those of you who follow like, the infrastructure world, I mean, like Netflix is really famous at this, right? Like, they have all these tools that they do to inject a whole bunch of like unknowns. And so we created this thing called Chaos Monkey. So, basically every Friday, Wednesday, we would run that to basically like hit the system really hard and do it in every possible way because we just cannot anticipate like what might go wrong. So since then, this whole thing started getting born. Like basically, if anybody did like a project review or like some kind of a product review, so they would say, so this guy he used to ask, okay, this all sounds great. You have a wonderful plan. Okay, what's your plan with unknown unknowns? And at first it used to stop people. They were like, what? I mean, I don't know. What am I going to do? So that's kind of used to be the reaction. But slowly that started dawning on people that what he's really saying is that, what's your plan? If shit hits the fan, something bad happens, what are you going to do? So really the question was like, how well prepared were you? Like obviously preparation really means like dispelling as much of the unknown as you want. And the second thing is like, how much of what's your response time? Like if something goes wrong, how are you going to respond? So I guess like these were like kind of the things that he was looking for to figure this out.
Thanks for the, and also obviously, unknown have impact. And Thomas, so you spend a lot of time thinking about productivity. And one concept that you mentioned in your article was internal locus of control. So it's the idea that you feel like you are in control, your motivation will go up. So if you are in control, your motivation will go up. But if you have unknown unknowns, you are not in control anymore. So does it mean that unknown demotivates you?
Yeah, and I can share a story about that. So if I look at, I spent almost 10 years at Box before I joined Checker. And if I can kind of split my time at Box in kind of two halves, and there was a big inflection point at the middle. And before the inflection point, if you mapped out my growth and my learning, it would kind of look like very small, kind of linear growth. And after the inflection point, it kind of spiked up. And that was both in how much I was learning, also like titles and promotion were happening, kind of reflecting how I was learning. And the inflection point that happened for me kind of at that midpoint was when I discovered the ownership victim mindset bias and kind of it ties to motivation and locus of control. And the situation for me was that I was really excited about growing as a manager, and our VP at the time said, hey, Tomas, great that you want to grow. We're going to hire someone that's going to manage you, and they're going to help you get to the next level. And so I took that and said, okay, that's great, exciting. And so if you kind of fast forward 6 to 9 months later, I was still waiting to grow because this person was supposed to have that responsibility and help me develop. And I was like, why isn't it happening? Why am I not growing? And I was a little bit confused, and it was actually my low point of the times. If you map out my engagement at Box, that was actually my low point where I was least engaged because the results weren't matching where I wanted them to be. So at that point, the big realization I had was that when you act as a victim when things are happening to you, your ability to get motivated and your ability to drive and grow is very, very limited. And I had spent the past 6 to 9 months in that mindset. And I discovered at that point that I needed to take a ownership mindset, and that no one was going to care about their career as much as I do. And I needed to drive my growth and take advantage of my manager, mentors, other peers in the company and leverage them for my growth and drive it myself. So when the driver switched from my manager to me, there was a big inflection point, both in how quickly I was learning and progressing, but also in my motivation. So it was a very, very interesting before and after. And there's an exercise we can do that I can share if it's interesting, where you kind of can reflect on this ownership victim mindset. And I can share it if the team's curious. So.
Cool. So I'm going to go now through 3 different phases of engineering leader life. So first, time manager, first time director, and first time you have to deal with exec. So kind of a natural evolution. So first phase is about when you were a first time manager. So first question, so what is obvious for you now that you didn't know when you transitioned to management for the first time? So Colleen, Murray, do you want to, what do you know now?
I think the biggest thing for me was when you're an engineer, you're very clear on what you're supposed to be doing. Like, you come in and you have bugs and you can see a clear path to being successful. And as a manager, I don't know, I felt like I didn't know how people would judge me. Like, how was I making progress? I wasn't delivering features myself. I wasn't fixing bugs. And so it was a big shock to me to decide that actually I'm helping others to do these things, and that's a good thing.
And to add to that, the helping others piece, whatever you did to get you to that point where you get that first-time manager job, there's some stuff that has to change. And one thing that I didn't realize was how important it was to check in with my team regularly and have very specific, almost interrogative type of check-ins. What I mean by that is every first-time manager knows that, hey, you need to set up one-on-ones with your team. It should be weekly, maybe it's bi-weekly, and it's a chance for them to talk. My unknown at the time was, if I had known to ask very specific questions from each employee each time, it would have helped me retain some of the engineers. Because I don't know if this has happened to you, but when you sit with your engineers or just to the rest of your team, and if you just go, hey, how's it going? How was your weekend? And if it's just a casual conversation, it may not cover things like, hey boss, I'm really unhappy because I feel like I'm always getting blocked. When I deal with this particular engineering team, XYZ always happens to me, and it's really making it so I can't ship things and I don't want to work here anymore. So I had to come up with a list of one-on-one questions that actually pulled that information out. And with my quietest team members and folks that were just not willing to just offer that, they're like, I'm strong, boss, I can do this. And then, the first time that you find out that they're really unhappy is when they tell you they're looking for another job. That means that you failed. And when that happened to me, I was like, that's never going to happen again. So generating that list and being really rigorous with your team and saying, stuff like, I'll do a rate your week 1 to 10. And even if the person's been smiling all week long, if they go, it's a 4, and then you go, oh shoot, okay, let's dig into that.
What's your best question?
Actually, this makes a lot of sense. So I've been accumulating such questions because it's been very, very handy tool to have. And actually, one of the things, this one I'm going to add to my list now. I think the one which I picked up from someone else, to do the question during one-on-ones, is at the end of the one-on-one, I just ask, is there anything I can do to help you? And that has always been a pretty useful one at the end, and then you kind of have to say it twice. And then usually people, you'll get some hit rate on that, and that's always helpful.
So I like to get at the motivation. So I like to ask people what motivates you, and go very direct to understand what are the underlying motivations, and then sometimes it's hard to discover that. So you can get at it by asking tell me about a time you were having fun or enjoying your work, and describe that. So those are 2.
Mary?
So for me, it's been, I've always been transparent and honest about how I feel about things. And so my team's always been able to come to me and talk to me. I rarely have people have left because I I have this openness. Well, I'll talk about my problems and what I see going on, and I'm very honest about it. And yet, I tell everybody we still have to do our jobs, but here's what's going on. And I think just being transparent yourself, they tend to tell me things that they wouldn't tell other people. So.
And what's your question to help them being more transparent with yourself?
My question to them? I'm not sure.
What's going on? So your question is from 1 to 10. Your question is, how can I help? What motivates you? Tell me. And how's going on?
What's your
How are you?
What's your biggest problem?
What's your
today?
biggest problem? Cool. So first question from the audience. Let's see. So it's a real thing. You can really ask questions, and I will really ask those questions. You can even vote for the best question. So the best question has 1 vote. So it's pretty like, how do you prepare your small team for unknown things that will disrupt their schedule without causing frustration? Who wants to answer?
Actually, the reason I'm answering this right away because we had this problem today. So it's actually like one of the smaller teams, and so they were planning out new infrastructure to build, and because as I mentioned, like the area I'm working in is very, very new and cutting edge. There's not a whole lot of things that people totally understand. So the entire thing is unknown unknowns, right? Like, so you don't really know like what is the problem that you're gonna face. So great, you're gonna build like a big infrastructure, and then what? Like, what if like it doesn't work? So the thing that I've always encouraged people to do, like facing these kind of situations, is like go talk to a few other people who have done somewhat in similar kind of work. So go, I mean, of course, like, I can't send somebody to Uber and say like, hey, go learn what they're doing. No, but you can find people who are doing like similar work, and you can go and like ask similar questions about, okay, if I am doing machine learning, like what kind of workflows do I use? I'm just using that as an example, but like you can kind of like go out there to prepare yourself for that, even if you don't know yourself.
I'll add a really quick one. I think whenever you see frustration, seeing it as an opportunity to channel that. And so whenever I see frustration on a team, I try to teach the mindset of like, let's turn this frustration into action, and let's use this energy to actually turn it into tangible next steps. And it goes back to feeling in control versus powerless. So it ties back to the motivation piece as well. Yeah, so there was a team that I was working with at Box, and we were there were a lot of interruptions, a lot of like fires that they were dealing with, and we all got together, we sat down, and we started trying to understand what was happening, and we all brainstormed on the whiteboard together to find like why is this happening and how can we solve it? And so we did a couple of things from that. So we found some common root causes. We prioritized those for next steps. We found issues with how things were getting triaged before they got to the team. So we created a list of top 3 things, and we went after them together to go solve them. So.
Yeah, so similar. When people come to me and they're whining and complaining about everybody else, my first question is, well, what would you do? Like, you're complaining about everybody not doing their job, so how would you do it? And I always turn it around back to them. Like, don't come to me with your problems. Let's come to me with solutions.
Yeah. So for security teams, I'm sure this is probably true of almost every team that you might manage in here. A lot of what happens during the quarter or whatever your funding cycle is an interruption. And the organization puts a lot of pressure on you and your team to deliver on planned goals. One of the things that I had to learn was don't try to plan every single minute, and actually just maybe plan 30 to 40% of the team's actual time around goals that we're measured on. And the rest of that time can be for incidents, interruptions, helping sales team close deals, or whatever random thing happens to come our way. I found that teams are a lot happier because if you have ambitious goals, that's one thing, but if you have too many goals, the team starts to feel downtrodden, and the rest of the organization looks at you like you constantly can't deliver. So we need to find someone else to do this job.
What about we go to the second phase? So it's going fast, promoting. Yeah, so you got promoted. So you were managing engineers, you were managing individual contributors, and now you are doing a good job at it, and you are promoted to being a manager of manager. So my first question would be for Mary. So as a VP of engineering, so you were leading, I think, 40 developers locally and 40 developers remotely in 4 different projects. And so leading 2 teams, one remotely and one locally, what's the single best thing you knew when you transitioned to those responsibilities?
The thing I wish I knew?
Yes.
Yeah. Dealing with cultures. So
Cultures.
actually I had 3 teams. So I had one in Palo Alto, one in Singapore, and one in Ukraine.
Okay.
The Ukrainians were contractors, but understanding that, all of these teams have a different way of working. So Singapore is very conservative. They're much slower. They're going to think things through. They're not willing to take risks. Palo Alto and Ukraine, more similar, where they're like on the cutting edge. They're always wanting to do something new. They're always wanting to push the envelope. And if I would have known that, it took me a while to figure that out because there was a lot of clashing between Singapore and Ukraine, and it was very difficult because they neither of them understood each other. And knowing that up front, you can at least tell people here's what's happening, here's why they're like that, and it's good. I mean, it's good to have. I learned with Singapore that it's good to have a little bit of somebody who's slowing us down because we're kind of cowboys in Silicon Valley. We like to do things on the cutting edge, and we're a security company, so we have to be careful, and we can't put out bad product. And so they held us accountable. So we learned over time to work together, but it would have been good to know that up front.
About remote and inside, do you have also some anecdotes to share?
Yeah, I guess like one thing, one mistake that it is very, very easy to do, like, especially if you're an engineering manager and you're very good at refactoring code, you refactor your organization. So you end up like carving like perfect boundaries, and then, then in the end, I mean, the first time I did that, so that we would have team meetings, and then one day we had a discussion which was really spooky. So they were like, why are we all together in the same team again? Because they had like very little to do with each other. So, and I think there were 2 failures on my part, which I wish I knew at the time. One was I didn't do a very good job of framing the situation for them, like, and how they kind of like, eventually will help each other. The second thing is like, you have to go out of your way to find reasons to connect all these people too. Like, sometimes you'll find, let's say there's a, like most organizations do like a quarterly or a biannual, like a pulse check. So maybe if there's some task that comes out of it, you make a work group that like spans across all these people. So to go and like make them do this. Or maybe like you organize, maybe there's a particular cell that needs to be tackled, and then you kind of like bring in like different skills to tackle that problem across from different tools. So you have to kind of go out of your way sometimes to do that.
Thomas?
One thing I'll share is I think a lot of growth on the engineering management track is navigating between the mindset of being underconfident and overconfident, and dealing with that kind of ambiguity in the middle. So on the underconfident side, that's imposter syndrome. So you feel like you're an imposter, should I actually be there? And then on the overconfident side, that's called Dunning-Kruger, whereas you underestimate how hard it is to do the next role. So when you go to manager of managers, you might think that it's easy because you've been a manager, but there's actually some complexity there. So one of the powerful things that I would recommend that I started using was, there's actually a manager that's here today that I remember a conversation I had with him, and he started telling me like, hey, that coaching session was really useful. Thanks for doing that. And so that was at a time where I felt more like an imposter. It was early on. And so that was validating. So basically asking for feedback is a good way to figure out if you're being too confident or underconfident in terms of how well you're doing with your role, and navigating these 2 mindsets is a kind of a critical part of the growth there.
So it's a way of calibration also. And
Yeah, exactly.
And do you think you are calibrated now?
You have to keep calibrating. You're never done. You're never done calibrating.
Cool.
So yeah.
Any So what about another promotion? Not yet. Okay. Not yet. So yeah, so you become a manager of manager. So what is the biggest thing that changed when you become a manager of manager for the first time, instead of being a manager of IC? I mean, any idea of what's the single biggest thing that changed?
Yeah,
Maybe all of you.
Yeah, we can talk. Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me, at least, was once you became a manager of a manager, you learned to be very, very careful when to talk to the engineer. Because if you're a manager, you're going to be talking to the engineer anyway. But if you're a manager of a manager, quite often, since I knew the entire thing and I kind of had dealt with all this, I had a tendency to go and talk to the engineers, and that would kind of completely derail the manager. And then one day, one of my managers came up and said, hey, you know what, Nanta, you're screwing this up, because now you're sending them up the wrong way, and this is really being painful. So I was like, oh, okay. So that was a pretty big learning moment for me. And then I learned, there are times when you get down there, but then you have to be very thoughtful about when you go there.
So mine is pretty much the same as that. When you start managing managers, especially if you think, oh, they're new, I'm trying to help them out, maybe they're not checking in with their employees enough, you can have this horrible hovering effect on the team, and you start taking power away from the managers who report to you, and you're not giving them a chance to grow. Coaching becomes really important, as you mentioned before, giving them coaching sessions, how they could talk to their team and elicit the type of feedback that you want to hear. And then really emphasizing in public, hey, your manager, Frank or Jesse or whoever it is, has done a really good job. I see that they're checking in with you. I see that they're doing this. So validating your manager in front of your manager's employees is really helpful. And if you start to feel like maybe your manager is slipping up a little bit, you can offer to have skip level meetings that are very formalized, maybe once a month or once every 6 weeks with your manager's employees. But it's not appropriate for you to approach them on a regular basis because you're just taking power away from your managers.
Have you seen skip level meetings?
Yes. Yeah. Some employees will take advantage of the skip level meetings, and some of them will say, you know what, I'm totally fine. My boss, Anne, or my boss, Bob, is really great, and I funnel everything through them. And that's actually what you want. But you should keep that door open, but you should never hover over your manager's employees.
And are the questions that you ask during those meetings different?
Yes, I actually don't solicit the same type of feedback because this person's not actually my direct employee. I just let them come in with their own agenda and they can talk about what they want to talk about. Because again, I'm not trying to take power away from my managers.
And the manager of that person, usually they feel comfortable about this? Yes.
Yes, I hope so. I didn't check in with that one, so you found me there.
Thomas, you wanted to add
Yeah,
something?
one of the things I realized starting to manage managers is the temptation you have when you're a manager is to treat the team that you're managing, your direct reports, as a first level manager as your first team, when actually your first team is your management team that you're a part of. And so there's a temptation to essentially have a team of silos because of that effect. And so one of the important things is to figure out ways to kind of break that mindset and get the management team to think about this team as their first team. So one of the things I would do is ask managers to pretend they have my job. What would they do differently to kind of encourage that ownership level at the team level and start to think about ideas that maybe are beyond their immediate scope.
Yeah, so in Windows, one of our VPs used to have this, the guy who used to run Windows, he used to have this thing where it's a without manager meetings. So then basically the team meetings, once a month, he would duck out of those meetings. So basically it was the rest of us who had to do because the dynamic changes when the manager is not there. So it was an interesting experience for us to kind of do that. The bonding becomes very different.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I did that too, where when there was all these catastrophes happening, I would just go to the engineer that I needed the help from and be like, look, you need to go do this. And eventually the managers started getting mad at me and be like, they have other priorities and it's kind of my job. And so I had to learn to first ask the question like, hey, what are your priorities? And then talk to their managers first before I derailed everybody on the next, major thing that was happening.
Thomas, do you have any concrete tips about breaking silos?
I would say read 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. That's probably one of the best books that kind of talks about this. It's done really well. And I think probably one of the more powerful things, there's a big framework there, but having shared goals as a team that are beyond the collection of the individual team goals is a really powerful way, because if you're all going after something together, then it feels like a team versus like, hey, we're doing this for this team, and the union of that is what we're responsible for.
So before going to the next phase, let's take one question. So I'm not sure this one is an unknown, but let's talk about this. I think it's more like a known unknown, or how do you ensure your team has a good work-life balance?
Oh, you sure? Okay, just a quick one. You probably have a lot of employees who want to show you like, boss, I'm tough. It's okay. I can work nights. I can work weekends. I can stretch. I can do this. I'm infinitely scalable. Like sometimes they'll say some version of that and you're like, okay, I do remember that for your performance review. But people can get burned out really, really quickly. It can be any number of things going on with health or personal life or too many goals. And one thing that I've found helps is you have to force people to take time off. And what I mean by that is during one-on-ones, one of the questions can be like, so I looked through your schedule. The last time you took time off was 9 months ago. Do you have any time off coming up? Should we schedule that right now? So being prescriptive and a little bit forceful in a way that shows I care about you and we'll be okay. I'll definitely call you if something explodes and we need your help, but I want you happy, healthy, and well-rested.
Yeah, I agree. It starts with you. You have to promote it. You have to tell the people it's okay to go to your, daughter's Halloween party today at 10. No one's going to die because you weren't here for an hour and a half. So it really starts at the top, and you have to tell them that it's okay, that there's other things besides work that are important. And I think they'll take that.
And I agree with that. Like, I think it starts at the top and it starts with setting an example. So I think like as a manager, you have to set an example. So again, like in one of the teams we used to work in Windows, like it used to be like very famous like in 90s for being a pretty slave driving place. Yes, right. You remember that. So people would kind of come to Windows, get burnt out, and then they would leave. And at some point, like we talked about it. And then we used to say, okay, look, if you're leaving at 5 o'clock, just send out a mail like saying that like, hey, I'm going to go take my sons to a soccer practice. And then it became more and more like of a custom in the team, like where people would realize that everyone has a life. And during my time at Facebook, that took it to another level because you are Facebook friends with everyone. So you understood, yeah, seriously, like, I mean, you knew everybody's life. And then it sounds very creepy or freaky, but actually it turned out far more healthier than that because you kind of start appreciating them for being human beings. Like they have hobbies, they travel, they have these kind of friends. And then it became like a much more saner way of, connecting with your people and then like, setting examples or learning from each other and feeding off each other in setting a balance is important. And one of my managers used to say, like, there is no work-life balance, there is life balance. And like, so really like, where do you choose to allocate your time is really like how people should think about it.
Okay, Colin, you've been promoted now. Congratulations. So, congratulations. So you have been working really closely with the executive team at Segment and at Twilio. So what were you surprised about?
So many surprises working with executives. So the first thing was that, if you're asked for the very first time to go meet with a group of executives and present your roadmap, metrics from your team, things that are important to your team, and if you have a sneaking suspicion that that E-team doesn't really know or care about what you do, you could be right. And the trap that I fell into, and my unknown that I'd like to share was at Twilio in particular, presenting that roadmap and what we planned on doing and what the look back looked like and how we measured ourselves. I looked around the E-team and half of them looked like they were either sleeping, texting, or bored. And there was one person who was looking at me like this, like, what is she talking about? And I spent so long on that roadmap, and I shopped it around to other fellow managers, and they're like, hey, it looks great, Colin, you're gonna knock them dead. What I didn't do, and what nobody told me, but I finally figured this out too late, was whoever's on your E-team, try to get on their calendar before that all-up E-team meeting. Show them the roadmap beforehand, and if you're talking to the head of sales, make sure something in your roadmap somehow relates to what head of sales cares about. CFO, same thing, or any head of anything, because if you don't introduce your ideas before the big table happens, some interesting things can happen. If you have a sleepy E-team, maybe you got off easy, but if you have an E-team that's maybe there's a little bit of infighting and intrigue and bad stuff going on, they might actually use you and your stuff as cannon fodder to start beating each other up. And so this is a whole nother level that I was not really prepared for. Once I started going to the individual E-team members and getting them to understand what is security, why do you have to care, what are we going to do for you? Just stuff that, you know, when you think about that and you do your roadmap, you roll your eyes like, for reals, like, does people at this level, they really don't know this stuff? They really don't know this stuff. So take your time and talk to each one of them. And then when you go to that big meeting, they're already 50% bought in. And that will make a better experience.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think like getting to know the end of the day, like the realization is that while these execs, like, you know, however senior or experienced they're human beings, right? And getting to know them as human beings is super important. And I mean, I have crazy stories from Windows days, but one of our execs used to give us a template to fill out. So I thought, you know, I could ace this test. So I'm gonna like add one more page and, you know, say more. And then I got a beating after that. So then I realized that that exec had a very fixed way of thinking about it. So I didn't know his mental processes. So there was a certain cadence with which he was thinking about vast amount of features. The fact that I deviated made him kind of lose track. So I didn't know that. Well, anyway, then I knew, and then it became like, okay, how do I actually convey it in his mental model? So that was a big learning. So I guess the takeaway here is try to understand those execs and how they operate, put yourself in their shoes and understand them better.
One thing to tie into that as well is one of my big realizations was that we always think about cascading information to give clarity to your team, so like the one way, but realizing that cascading is a two-way street, and the same way that you want to empower your team with a direction and clarity around the strategy and the vision, you have to cascade the other way. And you can imagine like the types of decisions the executive team can make if they don't have information about what's happening. So having that clarity is super, super important and empowering them.
Yes, so I dealt with some pretty crazy executives at Excellion. And but the last guy, the one thing I wish I would have done is talk to everybody else who'd already been in exec staff with him, because he tend to rage, and if you went off script, you know, God forbid you show him something that he didn't understand, it was crazy. Like you had to endure screaming at you, and everybody's just looking at you like, oh yeah, we already went through this. Should have told you about that, and don't move your mouse, blah, blah, blah. So the point is, yeah, prepare yourself. It is different. It's, they want information at a totally different level, especially if you're an engineer and you're used to details. The exec staff, a lot of them can't handle it, and they really need things rolled up in very simple words.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. So let me ask this question, and then we are going to take the a question with 3 upvotes. So it's tripling. So, Ananta, you have been working with really different types of products. So you have been leading teams at Instagram, Facebook, Dropbox, working on different types of products on mobile. Now you are leading the self-driving car software at Lyft. So you are obviously going to have many different challenges because obviously really different products. So you are going to have a lot of unknowns. How well are you prepared right now?
Not at, okay. I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, like it is whether it is a shocking thing or not, I mean, you're going to always have something that you don't know. The real thing is to have a little bit more of a humble mindset, because if you have a humble mindset and then you assume that you don't know a lot of things, or you don't know that you don't know a bunch of things, then it becomes a lot easier. So I think I mean, if you've seen the stuff that I've done, I've always jumped from one crazy thing after another, like where, people haven't really spent time figuring it out, whether it is like early days of graphics or, whether it is like dealing with large scale mobile software. I mean, people hadn't figured all these things out. So you always have to approach these problems with assuming you don't know a lot and assuming that there's a lot for you to learn. And there are people better than you that you have to go seek out. So, and that's really like all I take. And I guess the test for me really is like how, open I am to learning and feedback.
Do we have a question with 8 upvotes? Amazing. How would a manager prepare for a new team company? Lots of unknowns. I think, Thomas, you have a story about that, isn't it?
Because I just switched companies?
Yes.
Yeah, so I also have a Plato story about this as well. So for me, there's a really good book I read called The First 90 Days that talks about basically your goal when you're taking on a new team is going from a place where you're consuming a lot of value but not adding value to the place where you're break even, and then eventually to the place where you're adding a lot of value. And so there's a couple different things that you can do throughout that period to set yourself up for success. So I'll give you maybe 2 or 3 quick headlines. So one of them is, the first one is, make sure you properly assess what the status and situation is of the team you're taking, and don't assume that they're in the same state as your previous team. So having the flexibility to adapt is one of the biggest skills that you need as a manager to take on new teams. The second thing is that I always think about becoming an insider on the team. So becoming an insider means you're driving change from within. So that means having a lot of conversations, learning as much information, and building relationships with the team that you're having before you start making decisions if the situation makes sense for that. And the last one is to look for quick wins. So as you're building trust, you're going to find low-hanging fruit. So identify those early and help your team early instead of waiting until you're like fully ramped up before you start to contribute and add value. So the combination of all those things. One last thing, have an advisory board or people you trust that you can talk to, because it's hard. So having people with different perspectives that you're talking to regularly is really helpful as well.
I haven't changed jobs in a very long time, but I was just watching. I have a new VP of products that came in about 6 months ago, and the one thing I'm going to take away from watching him is he still to this day is very hands-off. Like you said, you have that transition, but I felt like 6 months, I mean, you should start making decisions. Like, we're all waiting for somebody to come in here and decide what we're going to do. And as head of products, I mean, you're supposed to do that. And that's the one thing I would try to do quicker is, you need some time to sit and watch and learn as you're coming up to speed. But at some point, you got to take the reins and you got to make the decisions, because people are looking to you for that.
So I think we are out of time. So one last word I wanted to add, maybe, and I think is going to be the topics of several different events next year. It's some word about diversity. And I think that when we are a team of people thinking all the same way and people all similar. It's also a way to not see the unknown unknowns. And when we add some diversity to teams, it could be interesting. One quote from Stephen Shapiro. If you're working on an aerospace challenge and you have 100 aerospace engineers working on it, the 101st aerospace engineer is not going to make that much of a difference. But if you add a biologist, a nanotechnologist, or a musician, and maybe now you have something fundamentally different, and you could see the unknown unknowns and things you didn't expect when you were the 100 aerospace engineers. Just wanted to open to maybe one next Plato event. This one is not over. We have tons of cocktails, we have tons of things still to do. So the next phase is going to be much more interactive. So we have a lot of things to discuss. So we are going to start a 20 minutes discussion roundtable. And so please share your anecdotes about unknown unknowns. Share how do you in general get better at managing those unknown unknown? How can you create a culture when you can identify and deal with them? So talk as a roundtable, and then we are going to do a synthesis afterwards when like one. Cool.
Now we want to hear what everybody's been talking about. So we have JB on that side with a microphone, and I'm over here with a microphone too. But we're going to start with this table right here because they have really good stuff to share. So first, who's going to do it?
I'm Ryan. I'm from the Bay Area. I actually work for a company called Agile, and I'm director of engineering. I'm going to speak on behalf of the team because they really have good insights. The first one is a lot of the unknowns. It's multiple things like new people, new processes, new projects. At the end of the day, those are mostly the unknown. One interesting unknown is a new location, culture, right? Which is very different. You've never dealt with that culture before. So those are some of the unknowns. I might mention more later. But the how we deal with it is actually also interesting. So one of the first things is adjustability. Just knowing that there are unknown unknowns out there, and if they come, then we'll deal with it, right? We'll adjust. We'll be flexible. We'll make adjustments. Changes to the plan. Just being adaptable and flexible. The other thing is it helps to be positive and be very open-minded. It helps to be a nice person kind of thing. Like being positive. Not like unknown unknowns. Like being positive helps. Being a good listener helps. And the other thing is priorities, right? Even if these are unknown unknowns, they still classify into certain buckets, right? Some aspects of the business or what we do in projects are still more important than others, right? So we kind of focus and push more the priorities there, how we spend time. Maybe we should reduce the amount of unknown unknowns in that particular area because the impact on the business is higher. Like I mentioned, like the being positive, that actually is the overarching one is management style. And it also crosses over with adaptability because we have one example where there are two teams and they behave differently and different management styles needed to be adopted because the people on those teams are different, right? So the manager didn't know that they have different personalities and coming in, not knowing that, when came in, listened, adopted, changed management style. So that's the other interesting thing. The other thing is, to Paul's point, there's a certain amount of healthy ratio of unknown unknowns because if you don't have enough, then maybe you're not taking enough risk. Maybe you're being too comfortable, right? But the right amount of ratio, fortunately, you'll have to figure out yourself, right? Depends on the stage of the company. If you're early stages, there's definitely more. If you're early stage and you have little unknown unknowns, then it's something to think about, the other thing. And for those early stages where there's a lot of unknowns and you know it, that there's a lot, you just need to welcome it, just like the first part. And another thing, going back to how to deal with it, positive management style and be humble, right? So a lot of the common theme is like just being humble, being open-minded, knowing that you don't know everything. But beyond yourself, there's also like, okay, I'm going to be open, I'm going to do this, this, and that, but trust is also a common theme. To deal with these unknowns, you need to be able to trust someone. You need to be able to leverage people, processes, the whole company to deal with the unknowns. You shouldn't go to and deal with the unknowns yourself. So there might be other people who've actually seen it, have actually encountered that unknown and know how to deal with it. And then seek mentors as part of it. And one last piece would be a lot of the unknowns also come from our own self. Like not even with the company, right? But you. There's one example from Anton that he didn't know that some of his suggestions and brainstorming is actually perceived by other people as the rule of law, that you're supposed to do it. It's like, so he was just brainstorming and whatnot, and people see, like, oh, he actually told us to do something, right? But it took some time to realize that. And I guess through feedback and a lot of discussions, you realize that, you have your biases, and you don't know what your biases are. You don't know what your mannerisms are. And that's where feedback comes. And that's it. Thank you.
I think the culture thing is interesting. My husband's an engineer, so we talk a lot about this. And like the whole blameless culture, I think, is relevant to what you were saying in terms of like dealing with unknown unknowns. And also with the leadership thing, I've worked with a lot of people on my teams that I push to have conversations with the CEO, for example, and like they come out of these meetings like, okay, I have to go do these 10 things, and it's like, well, I mean, first take a step back and see, which ones fit actually with the priorities that we all agreed on, and just because they said that in that meeting doesn't mean that you have to go off and do it right now and just throw everything out the window. So I think that's a really interesting point. Okay. Who's next? Yeah.
So this was a very cynical table. Mostly, I think the main theme that came out was acknowledging that it was a slightly cynical table.
Do you have French people there? Okay.
So the basic one was like, yeah, well, unknown unknowns are going to happen. You need to acknowledge it, get rid of your sort of ego, and put it aside that the path you have forged so far is the right path, and sort of try to assess as much as you can without having the strong endowment effect. But unfortunately, we all do have that. So there's that. That was, I think, the main theme here.
Well, you're in good company, at least.
Hopefully I speak well for the table. My name's Austin Cooley. I'm the CTO at a small company called Resource. So we had a couple different stories. Daniel's was just unknown unknowns around whether it's recruiting or just evaluating candidates. So not really expecting the significant gap between a lot of potential hires, where their skill level is, and where your kind of team's bar is, whatever that bar looks like, and how significant that can be, especially for people coming out of school or for coming out of boot camps or even people that have been working in the industry for a while. And then just kind of wondering if that's your bar or whether that's how you're interviewing or how you're onboarding them, and how you can kind of solve that. So that was an unknown unknown. We had a story about a small company. This is about work-life balance. So that really wanted to promote work-life balance, and so established kind of a value of full autonomy and output-driven culture. And as long as we're hitting our deadlines, if you want to, leave for a 3-day weekend, it's totally on you. And it was a very small company, so we expected the opposite to be true: a lot of burnout, a lot of overwork. And surprisingly, there was actually a team member that was kind of taking advantage of that, and so we had to address that early on. So it was just interesting. We cared so much about it, and we didn't want the burnout that we almost overcompensated and had to deal with it earlier than we thought we would. But we were kind of the solution there was to just be direct as soon as possible, and most likely it'll course correct very quickly. And then let's see. Face ID, recognize my face. All right. Okay, so then this was an interesting point by Tomas, which is if you're managing a team, for instance, at a company where everybody has $1 million in stock options, or everybody knows the brand and things are going well at the company, that's a lot different than potentially Anthony's company, where they went from 20 down to 15, and then over 6 years pivoted. We're almost out of money. You're going to learn a lot different lessons, maybe learn a lot faster as a manager if you work at a company like that. And so there's just value probably to be had at both. So it might be worth going to a smaller company at some point if you're working at one of those bigger ones. Did I miss anything? Oh, and we talked a lot about recruiting. There's 2 people at the table building recruiting software. So.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm the CTO at a startup called Atrium. We're a data-driven law firm. Our table focused on one-on-ones mainly, and also projects that change at the last minute. I don't know that we had any significant or amazing insights beyond what the conversation was before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the unknown unknowns that I had at my company, or I have had. In our company, we have a legal team and an engineering team, and both I consider priest classes that are used to being top dog at their respective companies. And so coming into Atrium, it's been a really interesting challenge to figure out how are these going to interact, how are these teams going to interact with each other in the best way possible, and how are we going to address that? And so our learnings have been cross-functional teams has really been a useful way to address this, and the lesson out of that is really making everyone feel like one team and giving them a vision beyond what any individual person or any individual team is focused on. We've done an onboarding buddy system where you're working with someone from the other side. We have people sitting with people in other teams. We've switched that back and forth. A lot of changes, and we're teaching lawyers how to create processes and how to turn those processes in product. And we're teaching engineers how to create or how to learn about creating a legal library, focusing on startups, things that are relatable to them. So those are our approaches, and I think the single vision really is the way that we've learned to address that.
Hey everyone, so I'm Pushkar. Sorry, were they going first?
No, you're good, Pushkar. Continue.
I'm director of engineering at a startup called Turo. For those of you who don't know, Turo is peer-to-peer car sharing, sort of like Airbnb for cars. My biggest unknown for today was that I was going to be nominated on this table. But I'll do my best, team. So over here we had Doug, who works at a startup called Navero, which I can't remember what they do. But I think one of the things, one of his biggest unknowns in his career was having to deliver some software to an enterprise customer with a strict deadline, and a lot of their team had a flu issue, and they weren't able to do that. So they had to get in touch with some lawyers to kind of work around that. We have Samantha joining us from Lyft, who is transitioning into an engineering manager role, and her unknown is how to conduct really positive one-on-ones. We have Shilpi joining us from Slack, who spoke about how to deal with scale. How do you know how to prepare for scale? And sort of a great takeaway for me there is it's really liberating to know that there will be unknowns and accepting that you might not know a solution. And Luke, who worked for many years at Google and is now VP of Engineering at Lyft, dealing with level 5 autonomy. So in some ways, the biggest unknown in this room, shared that, code is transient and you can only do so much. You can only plan so much for scale, and then at some point you're going to have to tear it down and start over. We also have, sorry, I can't see your tag. Alex. Alex has just moved from Atlanta to the Bay Area and works in a company that was started after the World War II. So in some ways, they're trying their company, which connects 80% of the world's airports, are trying to transition to the new age. The average employee age in their company is 45 years, which I'm sure seems fairly different to the setup in most of our companies. So their unknown is how to do that. Rahul represents Square today, and he shared a personal story where he actually was a CTO and a partner to a fairly strong co-founder, maybe it sounds like. But it really was, it turned out to be a much more intimidating and a top-down approach. And for him, his unknown was that as a manager, he really needed to step into a role and man up, to quote him, and call bullshit on the guy at the top to protect his team, and not really get into this mindset of us versus them mentality, which I thought was a really good story. And then we have Luke, who's joined us from Lyft once again. And we spent a lot of time discussing how Lyft can approach such a hard problem that nobody's really managed to solve. It's a level 5 autonomy, for those of you who don't know. And, how do you deal with experimenting and getting cars as they exist today to that? And and Luke shared some stories about how they build tools to kind of learn as quickly as possible. So the focus right now is just learning as quickly as possible. It's a lab mentality for now, but hopefully in the future, this is going to be a reality and a true product. Hopefully, I think that covered pretty much everything. Does anybody want to? Okay, all right. Thank you.
I'm Nikhil. I'm an engineering manager from Clever. And we spent a lot of our time talking about working with remote teams, and also what are the processes, what are some of the challenges that come up when working with teams and engineers who are spread across the world, as well as what are some of the processes that people can put in place to handle those challenges. Mainly we spoke about being comfortable with having things being more asynchronous, and kind of having a culture of understanding that you need to plan better because you might not get an immediate response. As well as dealing with some of the cultural differences that come up when you're dealing with teams across the world.
Thank you.
To tell you a bit just about the story, so 2 years ago, I hired my first engineer, and I have been in a really high, fast-paced environment, and I had a lot of unknowns, and I did a lot of mistakes. I lost a few great engineers along the way, and I wish at the time I could have met you and could have learned from you about all of those, because I guess that the best way to learn is to share our mistakes, is to share our knowledge, and we have the opportunity here to transfer our knowledge from one generation to the next and from peer to peer. So I learned a lot of things tonight about one-on-ones, about asking what motivates you, transforming frustration into an opportunity, asking them to be in our shoes to see how they would react to something. So have the buy-in of stakeholders before the meeting, deal with cultural differences with remote team, and figure out what are the strengths of each culture. Figure out what is the right ratio of unknown. And we need obviously to fail and to be unsuccessful to learn faster. Being absolutely humble and assume you don't know, so you can learn as much as possible and as fast as possible. Build cross-functional team, etc. So a lot of things I learned in only a few hours. So I wanted to share with you, so something that we put together is we have in our community, Plato, hundreds of mentors. So they are great engineering leaders. So Ananta is a mentor, Thomas is a mentor. So we have hundreds of mentors. And we built this website so that you could figure out with what we call stories, the stories and the learning of the engineering leaders who are part of the community. And the beauty of it is that you could meet them, and you could ask for advice. You could ask for mentorship. It's what we do at Plato. We are gathering together a community of people who are passionate about the topic. In this case, it's engineering leadership. We are collecting the challenges of people who are asking for help, and we are connecting people together. So that's what we do at Plato. So don't do like me. Take your responsibilities really seriously, because when we are manager, we have the responsibility to lead a team, to make them successful. And so I failed. I'm trying to get better, but I guess that we can all get better sharing with each other. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the speakers, panelists. Thank you for the mentors who are sharing every single week their knowledge and giving advice to the community of engineering leaders and the mentees that we are helping every single week. Thank you, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed. We have now a cocktail, we have food. Enjoy, and see you next time.